The axe came down before the sun cleared the ridge. Nell Callahan had been at it for 20 minutes, working through a cord of pine she had split and stacked herself 3 weeks ago, back when Daniel was still alive, and the wood was meant for both of them. Now it was just for her. She swung again. The log split clean. She set another one up without pausing, without looking at the house, without looking at the road that ran past the property toward town. The cold was already sharp at this hour. October in northern Montana did not ease into itself. It arrived like a verdict. Seth Pruitt came up the road just after 6 the way he usually did, moving slowly with the particular dignity of a man in his 60s who had learned that hurrying rarely changed anything. He stopped at the fence line and watched her work for a moment without speaking. That was the thing about Seth. He understood that sometimes a person did not need words. They needed someone to stand nearby and not leave. "Brought extra coffee," he said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." He set the thermos on the fence post and stayed where he was, looking out at the mountains to the north. The peaks were already white above the tree line. The snow up there had been falling for 2 weeks. Down in the valley, a Harrow Creek was still brown and gold with the last of autumn, but anyone who had lived here long enough knew what that white line on the horizon meant. Winter was not coming. It was already here, waiting for the right moment to move. Nell set another log on the block and brought the axe down. She was 38 years old, lean and capable in the way that comes not from vanity, but from necessity. Before she married Daniel Callahan, she had worked as a nurse at a clinic in Billings for 7 years. She knew how bodies failed. She knew how to read the signs of things going wrong before they became impossible to fix. That knowledge had served her well as a wife and would serve her even better in the weeks to come, though she did not know that yet. Daniel had been gone for 3 weeks, a fast illness, the kind that moves without warning and without mercy. One morning he was tired and running a low fever. 3 weeks later, Nell stood at his grave in the Harrow Creek Cemetery with mud on her boots and a numb, hollow feeling in her chest that she suspected would be with her for a long time. She had not cried much. She had been too busy. There were arrangements to make people, to thank, food to receive and quietly give away. And there was Calhoun Whitmore, Daniel's older brother, who had appeared at the funeral with his wife Edna and his nephew Rhett, and the particular expression of a man who has already decided something but has not yet said it out loud. Nell had noticed that expression. She had filed it away. She swung the axe again, and the wood split and the morning moved forward. Inside the house, after Seth left, she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and opened the small notebook she had found in the bottom drawer of Daniel's desk 2 days after the funeral. He had kept it for years, filling it with careful, precise observations, temperature readings, wind direction, snowfall measurements, notes about the mountains to the north, the way the ridgeline changed color in different light, the patterns he had noticed in 30 years of living in this valley. The handwriting was small and steady, the handwriting of a man who paid attention. She turned to the last page. There was a single sentence unfinished, written in slightly shakier letters than the rest, as though his hand had been unsteady that day. "If something happens to me," the sentence stopped there. She had read it 4 times in the past 3 weeks. Each time she closed the notebook before she could think too hard about what he had meant to write next. She closed it again, now finished her coffee, and went back outside. Calhoun's truck came past the property around 9 o'clock. It slowed as it reached her fence line. She could feel him looking at the house, looking at the woodpile, looking at her as she worked in the yard. The truck did not stop. It moved on toward town without the driver making any gesture of greeting. Seth, who had come back with a second thermos and was sitting on her porch steps, uninvited, in the way that old friends are permitted to do, watched the truck go. "He was at the law office in Millerton yesterday," Seth said. Nell did not respond. She kept working. "Saw his truck outside when I drove through." Seth wrapped both hands around his thermos. "Calhoun doesn't go to Millerton much. Nothing there that interests him except the bank and the lawyers." "I know," Nell said. That was all they said about it for the rest of the morning. The invitation came 4 days later. Calhoun Whitmore requesting the pleasure of Nell's company at dinner on Friday evening. That was how it was phrased in a handwritten note delivered by Rhett, who left it on her porch without knocking and was already back in his truck before she came to the door. She almost did not go. She stood in her kitchen that Friday afternoon for a long time looking at the note on the table, thinking about what it meant to refuse and what it meant to accept. In the end, she put on her coat and walked the half-mile to the Whitmore house, not because she expected anything good to come of the evening, but because she was not the kind of person who avoided hard things. The Whitmore house was larger than hers, built with money Calhoun had accumulated over 30 years of farming and careful dealing. Edna met her at the door with a smile that did not reach her eyes and took her coat with the practiced movements of a woman who had learned to be gracious in situations she did not choose. The table was already set. Calhoun sat at the head heavy and composed, a man entirely at ease in his own home. Rhett was at the far end eating a roll before the meal had officially begun, looking at nothing in particular. Edna sat to Calhoun's right and gestured Nell toward the chair across from her. The document was on the table beside Nell's plate. It looked like something that had always been there, like the salt shaker or the bread basket, something ordinary and unremarkable. But Nell noticed it the moment she sat down, and she did not look at it again until Calhoun cleared his throat. "You know why I asked you to come," he said. "I have an idea." He nodded as though she had confirmed something. He explained it in the measured, patient tones of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say. The property had been in the Callahan family for 2 generations. The deed was held in the family name. According to the terms of the elder Callahan's estate, ownership passed to the surviving male heir. That was Calhoun. The paperwork was in order. He had spoken with 2 different attorneys to confirm it. "I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow," he said. "You can stay through the winter. Come spring, I think it would be best if you made other arrangements." Nell looked at the document. She looked at Calhoun. She picked up her fork and took a bite of the roast that Edna had spent the afternoon preparing, and she chewed it slowly and she swallowed, and then she said, "Did Daniel know about this?" Something moved behind Calhoun's eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough. "The terms were always clear," he said. "That's not what I asked." Edna set her spoon down very quietly. Rhett stopped chewing. Calhoun's expression did not change, but the half-second pause before he spoke again told Nell everything she needed to know about the answer to her question. "The property is in my name now," Calhoun said. "You understand that?" "I understand it." "Good." He reached for his wine glass. "Then I think we can agree that this doesn't need to be more complicated than it has to be." Nell looked across the table at Edna. The other woman was looking down at her plate, her hands in her lap, her shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. She was not a bad woman. Nell had known Edna Whitmore for 5 years and had never once seen her do a deliberately unkind thing. But there was a difference between being kind and having courage, and Edna had always had more of the first than the second. "You know this is wrong," Nell said, not loudly, not with anger, just as a fact. Edna did not answer. She did not look up. Rhett made a small sound, something between a snort and a laugh, quickly suppressed. Nell set her fork down, folded her napkin, and stood up. She picked up her coat from the chair where Edna had hung it over the back, and she walked to the door. She did not slam it. She closed it the way you close a door when you are being careful, when you want to make it clear that you are in control of yourself, that you are leaving on your own terms. The night air hit her like cold water. She stood on the Whitmore porch for a moment, breathing slowly, looking out at the mountains to the north. The stars were very clear. When the air is that cold and that dry, the stars look closer than they should. Seth was waiting for her at the end of the Whitmore driveway. She stopped when she saw him. "You knew I'd be coming out early," she said. "I had a feeling." He fell into step beside her as she walked. They moved in silence for a minute or two, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Calhoun came to see me," Seth said, 2 weeks ago. She waited. "He had a letter. He wanted me to sign it. The letter said that Daniel had told me personally that he always intended for the property to go back to the family if he died without children." Seth paused. "He said 4 other people in town had already signed it." Nell stopped walking. "Did you sign it?" "No." She started walking again. "Lester Holt was one of the 4, Seth said quietly. "I thought you should know that. Lester Holt, who had fixed her barn roof 2 summers ago without being asked, who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at their table 3 years running, who had stood at Daniel's graveside and shaken Nell's hand and said that Daniel was the best kind of man this valley ever produced. She filed that away too. 3 days later, Floyd Renner came to her house. Floyd was 46, the town's blacksmith, a big, quiet man with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of hands that showed decades of hard work. He had been Daniel's closest friend since they were boys. He had been the person Nell called when Daniel's fever first spiked, and he had sat with her in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours without complaint. Just present, just solid, the way a good friend is supposed to be. He came in the morning and sat at her kitchen table and held his coffee mug with both hands and looked at the grain of the wood for a long moment before he spoke. "I talked to Calhoun," he said. "I figured you might. And I talked to 2 members of the town council." He was still looking at the table. "Nell, the paperwork is legitimate. I had someone look at it." "I know it's legitimate." He looked up then. "I'm trying to help you." "I know you are." She sat down across from him. "Floyd, why did you come here today? To help me or to make sure I'm not going to make things difficult?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. He had the decency to not look away from it. "Winter's coming," he said finally. "The town needs things to be stable. So the town doesn't have time for justice." He put his coffee mug down. He stood up. He was a man who cared about doing the right thing genuinely, and that made it harder, not easier, to watch him put on his coat and move toward the door. A villain was simple. A good man choosing the wrong thing because it was easier was something else entirely. "I'm sorry," he said at the door. "I know you are." She stood at the window and watched his truck pull out of her driveway, and for the first time since Daniel died, she felt a specific weight of being completely alone. Not lonely. Alone. There was a difference. Loneliness was an ache. This was a clarity. She was the only person in Harrow Creek who was going to look out for Nell Callahan, and she had better start thinking about what that meant. That evening, Seth came to the door with something wrapped in canvas cloth. He held it out without explanation. She took it, unwrapped it, and found Daniel's iron knife, the one he had carried for 20 years, used for everything from cutting rope to dressing game. The handle was worn smooth from use, warm from Seth's hands. "He left this with me about 2 years ago," Seth said. "Didn't explain why. I've thought about it a lot since he passed." He looked at the knife in her hands. "I think he knew his health was worse than he let on. I think he was being careful in the way he was always careful." Nell turned the knife over in her hands. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe she was just tired. "Thank you," she said. Seth nodded once and left without coming inside. She put the knife in the front pocket of her pack that night. Calhoun came on a Tuesday, 8 days after the dinner. He came in the morning, which was deliberate. People in the valley respected the morning. Business done in the morning was serious business. He brought Rhett, who stood near the woodshed with his arms crossed, saying nothing, watching. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He explained again with the same measured patience he had used at dinner that the arrangement they had discussed was the only reasonable path forward, that he wished things were different, but they were not, and that she should consider heading south toward Billings or Missoula, where she had connections and where the coming winter would be less severe. Nell carried her things out in 3 trips: the pack with her clothes and what food she could carry, the bedroll, the small camp stove, Daniel's knife. She was at the door for the last time when Calhoun spoke. "You should go south," he said. "The mountain roads in this season are dangerous for someone alone." She stopped. She did not turn around. "I know these mountains better than you think," she said. The door closed behind her. Softly. Completely. The sound of a thing being finished. She did not look back at the window, though she knew Edna was standing there. She had caught the movement in her peripheral vision, the pale shape of a hand against the glass. She kept her eyes forward and her steps even, and she walked away from the house where she had lived for 5 years without once allowing herself to run. She took the north trail out of the valley because it was the only direction that did not require her to walk past anyone she knew. The path climbed through pine trees and over rocky ground, rising steadily toward the foothills. The air smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and the particular metallic sharpness that people who have lived in the mountains learn to associate with incoming snow. Not today, but soon. By the time she made the first ridge, the town was behind her and below her, small and quiet in the afternoon light. She did not stop to look at it. She walked until dark, found a sheltered hollow between two boulders, and made a small fire with dry pine branches she gathered from the forest floor. The fire was not enough. She had known it would not be enough, but she built it anyway because having something to do with her hands was better than sitting still in the cold and thinking. She wrapped her blanket around her and sat with her back against the rock and looked at the sky between the trees. The clouds were moving fast from the west, not the light, thin clouds of an ordinary cold front. These were heavy, stacked high, moving with the purposeful speed of something serious. She woke at 2 in the morning with a stiff of fingers and frost on her blanket. The fire was out. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, and then she sat up and looked at the sky. The clouds had covered the stars completely. The air had changed in the way it changes before a major storm, a pressure difference that is almost physical, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. She had maybe 36 hours before the worst of it arrived, possibly less. She could not go back down, not now. Returning to Harrow Creek meant walking back into a town that had already decided she was someone who needed to leave, and she was not willing to do that, not on those terms, not yet. Going south the way Calhoun had suggested meant open ground and exposed ridges and no shelter she could reach before the storm. She packed her things in the dark, working by feel, her hands slow and clumsy with the cold. The knife slipped out of the front pocket of her pack as she lifted it, landed blade first in the frozen ground, and stood there for a moment in the thin moonlight that was filtering through a gap in the clouds. She reached down to pick it up. The blade was pointing northwest, into the thickest part of the fog that had settled into the upper valley to her left, into the direction that no one from Harrow Creek traveled in winter, because there was nothing up there, no trails anyone used, no hunting grounds worth the climb. She stood there for a moment holding the knife. She was not a superstitious woman. She was a nurse. She believed in evidence and cause and effect in the mechanics of the physical world. But she was also a woman who had just lost everything she thought was hers, and she was standing alone on a mountain in the dark with 36 hours before a serious storm, and one direction was as good as another. She put the knife back in her pack and went northwest. She smelled it before she saw it, not the cave itself, the absence of cold, a pocket of air that simply was not doing what all the air around it was doing, not biting, not moving, not carrying the weight of the coming storm. She had been walking for 2 hours in the gray morning light when she stepped through an invisible boundary and felt the temperature change against her face, like walking from one room into another. She stopped. The snow had been falling since dawn, light and steady, the kind that did not announce itself dramatically, but simply continued patient and thorough, covering everything at the same rate. It had settled on the pine branches above her and on the rocky ground beneath her and on the tops of her boots and on the shoulders of her coat. But 20 feet ahead, where a cluster of old-growth trees stood close together above a low shelf of granite, the ground was bare, not cleared, just bare, as though the snow had been falling in a slightly different world over there and had not quite managed to reach this one. She took 3 steps toward it, then 3 more. The air continued to change. By the time she reached the granite shelf, she could feel it clearly, a warmth that had no visible source rising from somewhere below and ahead of her. The entrance was easy to miss. A low gap beneath the root system of the largest pine, the opening barely 2 feet high, framed by stone worn smooth by centuries of water. She would have walked past it if she had not already been looking. She crouched down, looked in, saw darkness, and felt warmth pressing outward against her face, and she crawled inside. The passage opened almost immediately. She stood up into a space that surprised her with its size. A vaulted chamber of gray and ochre stone, maybe 15 feet across at its widest point, the ceiling arching high enough overhead that she could not quite make it out in the dimness. The walls were smooth in a way that natural spaces rarely are worn by water over so much time that all the rough edges had been taken away. At the far end, barely visible in the low light, something moved on the surface of a shallow pool. She walked toward it. The warmth intensified, By the time she reached the pool's edge and knelt down and pressed her hand to the surface of the water, she had to remind herself to keep breathing. Warm, not tepid, not merely above freezing, genuinely continuously warm. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pool and understood what she was looking at. Deep underground water finds its way down through the rock until it reaches formations heated by the earth itself. The pressure builds. The water rises back up through fissures in the stone, carrying that heat with it. In the high country of northern Montana, the geological conditions for this were rare but not impossible, particularly along the older fault lines where the bedrock had been fractured and reshuffled over millions of years. The cave itself acted as an insulating shell, the stone absorbing and holding the heat, the narrow entrance blocking the exchange of cold air from outside. She sat in that warmth for a long time without moving. She had been cold for 3 days. Not dangerously cold, not yet, but cold in the constant, exhausting way that costs you energy and attention and eventually starts to cost you judgment. Sitting in that cave with warmth rising from the water and from the stone itself, she felt the cold leave her body gradually, completely, with something close to relief. Then she stood up and started measuring the space with her feet. 18 paces from the entrance to the back wall, 12 paces at the widest point narrowing toward the front. The pool occupied roughly a quarter of the rear section, shallow at the edges and deepening toward the center. The floor was mostly flat, rising slightly toward the entrance, which meant cold air pooling near the opening would have less tendency to flow deeper into the cave. She had spent 7 years as a nurse. She understood spatial triage. How many people could this space hold? How would they be arranged? What would the priorities be? She was not thinking about that yet, not consciously, but the calculation was beginning somewhere beneath conscious thought, the way important calculations often do. She went back outside and gathered pine branches and stones and spent 2 hours building a low wall across the lower half of the entrance, not blocking it entirely, but reducing the gap enough to cut the wind without eliminating the airflow that kept the cave from becoming damp. The work warmed her further and settled her mind in the way that physical work settles a mind that has been dealing with things it cannot fix by thinking about them. That night, she slept without a fire for the first time since she had left the valley. She did not need one. The days that followed had a structure she had not expected to find this quickly. Morning check and reset the snares she had laid along the eastern tree line, the ones Daniel had taught her to set when they first moved to the valley, back when she was still learning how to live in a place where knowing how to trap and hunt was not a hobby, but a form of security. He had shown her the principle once, and she had not fully listened, too confident in the adequacy of the grocery store in Millerton, 30 miles away. She listened better now out of necessity, and the traps began to produce on the 4th day once she corrected the placement. The first time she had set them with the opening facing the wrong direction relative to the prevailing wind. Animals moved into wind, not with it. Daniel had told her that. She had filed it away in the part of her memory reserved for things she did not think she would need. Afternoon improved the cave. She added a second layer to the entrance wall. She built a sleeping platform from flat stones and pine boughs, elevated 6 inches off the ground, positioned at the point where the warmth from the pool was strongest, without the moisture from the steam being a problem. She found a narrow shelf in the rock near the back where the temperature stayed most consistent and used it to store food away from the ground. Evening, she opened Daniel's notebook. Not to read his entries. She had read those enough times to have certain passages memorized. She opened it to write in it herself in the blank pages at the back, the same categories he had always tracked. Temperature estimated by feel and by the behavior of the moisture on the cave walls. Wind direction noted when she went outside to check the traps. Cloud formations. The rate of snowfall accumulation against a marked stone she placed just outside the entrance. She was learning the mountain the way he had learned the valley, by watching it carefully over time and writing down what she saw. It was on the 6th evening that she found the marks. She had been examining the rear wall of the cave near the pool, looking for any instability in the stone, any sign that the ceiling might be problematic in a heavy freeze. In a narrow recess at the base of the wall, almost invisible in the low light, she found them. Not writing, not any kind of letters or words. A series of horizontal lines cut into the rock at regular intervals, each one labeled with a small numeral, each one accompanied by what appeared to be a seasonal marker, a crude representation of a sun, a snowflake, a rain line. Someone had been measuring the water level of the pool across multiple seasons, recording the results in stone. She ran her fingers along the lines. The cuts were old. The edges had softened with time, but the system was clear and deliberate, the work of someone who had stayed here long enough and trusted this place enough to bother tracking it over years. The water level had never dropped below the third line from the bottom. She sat with that for a while. Then she took her own notebook and recorded the current water level and the date as accurately as she could estimate it, adding her mark to a record that had been started by someone she would never know. The storm arrived in the second week with a seriousness that changed the character of everything. This was not the steady accumulating snowfall of the first days. This was the kind of storm that the old-timers in Harrow Creek called the White Wall, and the name was accurate. It came from the northwest in the early morning, and within 4 hours the forest outside the cave entrance had become a wall of moving white visibility down to 15 feet, the wind driving snow horizontally through the trees with a sound like gravel on glass. The temperature outside dropped through the day and kept dropping. Inside the cave, nothing changed. The stone held its warmth. The pool continued its slow, steady movement. The air stayed still. She stood at the entrance for a while in the first hours of the storm and watched it. She had lived in Montana for 5 years, and she had never seen weather come in quite this way, with this much weight behind it, as though the sky itself had made a decision and intended to follow through completely. At some point during that first long day of the storm, her eyes found the valley below through a gap in the trees. Harrow Creek was still visible, just barely a smear of dark structures against white. She could make out the smoke from chimneys, thinner than it should have been for weather this severe, a few thin gray lines where there should have been thick ones. She looked at that for a moment. Then she went back inside. She did not let herself think about the people down there. Not yet. Instead, she worked. She reinforced the entrance wall. She organized her food supply and calculated how long it would last and what the traps would need to produce to supplement it. She was methodical and practical about all of this, the way she had learned to be methodical and practical in the emergency room during her nursing years, when emotion was something you set aside until the work was done, because the work could not afford to wait for you to feel your way through it. But the work got done, and then there was the evening, and in the evening there was no emergency to manage, and no task demanding her full attention. And the quiet of the cave and the warmth of the pool and the notebook open on her sleeping platform created a space that her carefully maintained practicality could not entirely fill. She picked up the pencil. She turned to the last page of Daniel's entries, the one with the unfinished sentence, and she read it again. If something happens to me. She looked at those words for a long time. Then she put the pencil to the paper and wrote in her own hand directly after his, "Then I will be all right, y'all." She closed the notebook, set it beside the knife on the sleeping platform, sat with the warmth of the pool on her face and the quiet of the cave around her, and allowed herself for the first time since she had left the valley to simply be in the place where she was. It took her a long time to understand what she was feeling. It was not happiness. It was not peace exactly. It was something more foundational than either of those things. It was the particular steadiness of a person who has survived the thing they were most afraid of and discovered that they are still standing. The storm did not let up after the first day. It settled in the way serious winters settle without apology, without indication of when or whether it intended to end. The snow continued, the wind continued, the temperature outside continued to drop. Inside the cave, the days organized themselves around the rhythm she had established. Traps in the morning, cave maintenance in the afternoon, the notebook in the evening. She was not comfortable in any pampered sense of the word. She was adequate. She had what she needed, and she was not wasting anything. And that combination produced a kind of efficiency that she found unexpectedly satisfying. She was thinking about this, about the difference between what people said they needed and what they actually needed when she heard footsteps in the snow outside. She was up and at the entrance wall with the knife in her hand before the sound had fully registered as human. She waited, listening. The footsteps came closer. They had the heavy, irregular rhythm of someone moving through deep snow with difficulty. She peered through the gap above the entrance wall and saw Rhett Whitmore. He was below the cave entrance, at the edge of the tree line, moving along the slope in the general direction of the area where she had set her eastern snares. He was not dressed for conditions this severe. His jacket was the everyday kind, not the insulated kind. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold offense and everything to do with actual cold, the kind that had been working on him for a while. She watched him move. He was looking at the ground, then at the slope above him, then at the ground again. Tracking. He was good at it, actually better than she had expected. She watched him find the spot where she had walked that morning and follow her footprints with his eyes up the slope toward the trees near the cave entrance. She put the knife in her belt and stepped outside. He heard her immediately and turned, and for a moment they both stood still in the diminished snowfall of the storm's midday pause, looking at each other across 30 feet of white slope. "You're still here," he said, not a question. Clearly, he looked at the trees behind her, estimating. His eyes were sharper than she had given him credit for. "Where are you staying? Nobody can survive out here in the open." "That's my business." He took a few steps toward her, not aggressive, careful. "Calhoun wants to know if you're all right." She looked at him steadily. "Rhett, I know why you're here, and I know why he sent you specifically, because you know this mountain better than anyone else he could have asked." She let that sit for a second. "He wants to find what I found." Something shifted in Rhett's face. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to the look of a person who has been seen doing something they were not certain they should have been doing. "You should come back down," he said. "It's not safe up here. I'm safer up here than I've been in weeks." "Nell, go home, Rhett. Tell Calhoun I'm alive and I'm fine, and what I found on this mountain does not belong to him." She held his eyes. "And get yourself a better jacket before you come back up here. That one will get you killed." He stood there for another moment. Then his eyes moved to the slope behind her one more time, calculating the angle, noting the direction she had come from. He nodded once and turned back down the mountain. She did not return to the cave by the direct route. She went north along the ridge for 20 minutes, stepping from rock to rock where the stone was bare and wind-scoured, leaving no clear prints, then circled back from the west through the dense trees where her passage was broken up by the undergrowth. It took her 40 minutes longer than the direct route. She did not care. She understood now with complete clarity that Calhoun Whitmore did not want only the valley land that had once been Daniel's. He wanted everything, every resource, every advantage, every position of strength. He was that kind of man, the kind who could not tolerate the existence of something he did not control. 2 mornings later, she was checking the northern snare line when she saw Edna Whitmore. The older woman was coming up from the valley along the main trail, alone, moving slowly and carefully, in a long wool coat that was not designed for mountain conditions, her breath coming in labored pulls that told Nell she had been climbing for some time. Her cheeks were red. Her eyes, when she finally got close enough for Nell to see them clearly, were the eyes of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a while and had decided finally to put it down. "I didn't know he would do this," Edna said before any greeting. She said it the way people say things they have been saying in their heads for a long time and are finally saying out loud. Nell looked at her. "You climbed up here to tell me that?" "I climbed up here to warn you." She pulled a slow breath. "Rhett told Calhoun that you're still on the mountain. Calhoun is telling people in town that you're staying up here out of spite, trying to make trouble, contesting the property without any legal ground." She paused. "He's building his version of the story before you can tell yours." Nell understood the strategy immediately. Of course, control the narrative from the beginning. By the time Nell came down, if she came down, everyone in Harrow Creek would already have an explanation for her behavior that made Calhoun the reasonable party. "Did you sign the letter?" Nell said. "The one with the signatures." Edna's silence was answer enough. "He put it in front of me," Edna said finally. "I didn't know what to do." Now you do. Nell's voice was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. It was the voice of a person who has run out of the kind of patience that can be replaced with goodwill. Next time something is wrong, Edna, do the right thing before it becomes the wrong time to do it, not after. Edna nodded. She looked old and small in her wrong weather coat on the snow-covered slope. She turned to go, then she stopped. The Holt family, she said, not turning around. Their little girl, Meg, she's been sick, running a fever for 4 days now. And the firewood situation in town is worse than people are saying. She paused. I thought you should know. She went back down the trail without waiting for a response. Nell stood in the silence after she left and looked at the trees and looked at the sky and finally looked back up toward the cave entrance. She could not see from where she stood, but knew was there warm and waiting. She thought about Meg Holt, 4 years old, 4 days of fever and inadequate heat. She thought about what she knew and what she had and what it was worth. She went back to the cave and sat by the pool for a long time that evening, alone with the warmth and the quiet, and the question she had been half asking herself since Edna had mentioned the child's name. It was not a simple question. It was the question that lived underneath all the other questions, the ones she had been careful not to look at directly. These people had watched Calhoun take everything from her. Some of them had helped him do it. They had signed their names. They had chosen stability over justice. They had decided that her inconvenience was an acceptable price for their comfort. And now Winter was asking them to pay a different price. She could stay exactly where she was. She had enough. The cave was hers, the warmth was hers, the sufficiency she had built with her own hands over 2 hard weeks was hers, and no one could take it from her because no one knew where it was. She picked up Daniel's notebook, opened it to the back, read what she had written in the blank pages, the temperature records and wind observations and water level measurements, the quiet, faithful record of a person learning to understand a place. She thought about Daniel spending 30 years watching this valley, writing it all down, building a store of knowledge that he had passed on to no one except in fragments and suggestions, the way he had told her about the wind and the traps in the mountain without ever knowing she would need it so badly. He had recorded things because he believed that what you understood and preserved could eventually be of use to someone, even if you were not there to see it used. The cave was large enough for 25 people arranged carefully, probably 30 if it came to that. She had measured it herself. She knew exactly what it could hold. Meg Holt was 4 years old and had been sick for 4 days in a house that could not hold its heat. She closed the notebook, set it down beside the knife. The decision, she realized, had actually been made some time ago. She was only now catching up to it. She began calculating what the next morning would require. She was reviewing her snare positions in her head, thinking about which supplies she would need to move and where she would place people when they arrived when she heard the sound. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours, the deep, solid sleep of someone physically spent. She came awake all at once the way she used to come awake during night shifts when something changed in a patient's breathing. Not gradually, instantly. The sound came again. From the entrance, low and rough. The sound of a person coughing. She was on her feet with the knife before thought intervened. She moved to the entrance wall and looked over it into the darkness beyond. 3 men. The nearest one was on his knees in the snow, one hand against the outer stone wall for support. Behind him, 2 more figures, barely upright, leaning on each other. The storm had returned while she slept, and it had come back harder than before, and these 3 men had somehow climbed through it to arrive at the entrance of a cave they could not possibly have known existed, except that one of them did know where she had gone, or had followed where she had gone, or had followed where Rhett's eyes had tracked 2 days ago up the slope toward the tree line. The man on his knees looked up. Floyd Renner. His face was white with cold in a way that went beyond discomfort. His lips were cracked and dark. His hands, even in the dimness, looked wrong, stiff and poorly colored in the way that hands look when the cold has been working on them long enough to do real damage. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. He tried again. "I'm sorry," he said. Then his knee gave out, and he went down into the snow. Behind him, she could see Lester Holt, the man who had signed Calhoun's letter and eaten Thanksgiving dinner at her table and stood at Daniel's grave and called him the best kind of man the valley ever produced. and a younger man she barely recognized through the snow and the bad light, Colt Becker, 22 years old, the youngest of the farming families, his face half covered by a snow-stiffened scarf. She looked at Floyd in the snow in front of her cave. She looked at her own hands on the entrance wall. She thought about what she had been asked to carry, and what she had agreed to carry, and what she had never agreed to carry, but was being asked to carry anyway. And then she stopped thinking about it entirely because there was a man in the snow who needed to be moved in the next 60 seconds, or the decision would be made for her in a way she could not reverse. She stepped over the wall and put her hands under Floyd Renner's arms and pulled him toward the entrance. He was heavy. She pulled anyway. Floyd Renner had not cried since his father's funeral 14 years ago. He cried in the cave that first night silently with his back against the wall and his damaged hands pressed between his knees for warmth, tears running down his face without any sound accompanying them. Nell saw it and said nothing. She was working on Lester Holt's feet, which were in worse condition than Floyd's hands, checking the circulation in each toe, methodically pressing and releasing, watching the color return or fail to return. Colt Becker was already asleep on the far side of the cave, passed out the way young bodies pass out when they have been pushed past their limit completely and immediately. The pool moved quietly behind her. The warmth pressed in from the stone. "How long were you out in that?" she asked Lester, not looking up from his feet. "Since yesterday morning," he said. His voice was rough. "We thought we could make it up the North Trail. Floyd said he knew where you had gone." A pause. "He didn't know exactly. We were guessing." "You guessed well." "Rhett," Floyd said from across the cave. His voice was thick. "He didn't tell us directly, but I saw him looking at the slope when he came back 2 days ago. The angle of it. I've known Rhett since he was 8 years old. I know what his face looks like when he's filing something away." Nell set Lester's feet down gently and covered them with the extra blanket from her pack. She looked at Floyd. His color was coming back. The hands would be sore for days, but they would be all right. "Tell me about the town," she said. Floyd straightened slightly, the way men straighten when they are given something concrete to address. "The Woods situation is the worst of it. We calculated wrong in September. 3 families are completely out. The Hendersons, the Praters, and old Hiram Simmons, who lives alone on the East End." He stopped. "Calhoun has 3 full cords in his barn. He won't share them. He said he can't guarantee his own family's needs through the winter if he gives anything away." "He has 3 cords," Nell said. "3 that we know of, probably more." "And the Holt girl?" Lester flinched. It was small, but she saw it. "Meg has been running fever for 5 days now. My wife has been keeping her as warm as she can, but the house drops to 50 degrees overnight. We've been burning furniture." He looked at his own hands. "I need to get back to them. You need to be able to walk first." She looked at both of them. "How many people need to be moved?" Floyd had clearly been thinking about this on the way up. 22 people who have no adequate heat source. Reverend Penn has opened the church and people are consolidating there, but the church building is old and it leaks cold in a dozen places, and it's not designed to hold that many people for more than a night or two. This cave holds 25 easily, 30 if we arrange it carefully. She stood. "I already know how to place them." Lester looked at her. Then he looked around the cave, at the pool, at the walls, at the ceiling, at the steady, sourceless warmth that had been working on his body since they dragged him through the entrance. Something crossed his face that was not quite shame and not quite gratitude, but occupied the territory between them. "I signed that letter," he said. "I know you did." "I didn't think—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself it was a civil matter, that it wasn't my business to get between Calhoun and his family's legal rights." Nell looked at him for a moment. "Your daughter's name is Meg, and she's been sick for 5 days, and you burned your dining room chairs to keep her warm." She picked up her coat from the sleeping platform. "That's enough accounting for tonight. Sleep, we move at first light." She did not sleep again herself. She sat by the pool in the dark and ran through the logistics of what the next 3 days would require. The route down had to be navigated carefully in storm conditions. People would need to be grouped by mobility. The elderly and the children, first then the families, then the single adults who could manage the climb with less support. She needed Floyd functional as quickly as possible because she could not move 22 people up a mountain in a blizzard alone. She also needed Rhett Whitmore. She thought about that for a while. Rhett had grown up in Calhoun's shadow, had learned Calhoun's way of reading the world, had spent 28 years being formed by a man who treated every interaction as a transaction and every resource as something to be controlled. And yet he had stood at the edge of the North Trail 2 days ago and told her he knew this mountain better than anyone else Calhoun could have sent. He had not said that to threaten her. He had said it the way a person states a fact about themselves when they are trying to be useful. She had seen something in his face when she turned him away. Not resentment, something more like recognition, the look of a person who has just been told a true thing about themselves and does not yet know what to do with it. She thought she knew what he would do with it if given the chance. The descent took 3 hours in the storm conditions, moving carefully, testing each step on the packed snow. When Harrow Creek came into view below them, the town looked diminished in a way that went beyond the weather. Smoke from only 4 or 5 chimneys. The church at the center of town with a faint light in its windows. A section of fencing on Main Street collapsed under accumulated snow. The grain store's roof sagging visibly on the east side. Reverend Yan opened the church door before they knocked, as though he had been watching the trail. He was a tall, spare man in his mid-60s, gray and weathered, the kind of man whose face had been set by decades of listening to hard things without flinching. He looked at Nell, looked at Floyd, looked at Colt, and stepped back from the door without a word. Inside, 18 people across the pews and the floor, wrapped in every piece of clothing and every blanket the town had been able to consolidate. The air was cold enough to see breath. A single wood stove at the front was burning low, fed with what looked like broken pew backs. Children were clustered in the warmest corner, near the stove. An older woman Nell recognized as Floyd's aunt was sitting upright in a pew with a baby wrapped inside her coat. Nell found Meg Holt in the second pew from the front, in her mother's lap, small and pale and too still for a 4-year-old. Her forehead was hot against Nell's palm. Her breathing was shallow but regular. She was not in immediate crisis. She was, however, exactly where Nell had expected her to be, on the wrong side of a threshold that would move the wrong way if the cold continued. She stood up and looked at the room. She knew these people. She had lived among them for 5 years. She had brought food to their houses when they were sick, had driven their children to the clinic in Millerton when Calhoun was not available, had sat with their elderly parents on the long winter afternoons when the days were short and the isolation was heavy. And most of them had watched Calhoun Whitmore take her home and her land and her 5 years and had decided that it was not their business. She did not say any of this. She looked at the room, at the cold, at the children, and she said, "There is a place in the mountain that is warm. I am going to take you there. We move in groups of 5, starting with the children and the elderly. The climb takes 2 to 3 hours, depending on conditions. You follow where I lead and you do not stop moving. Does anyone here have a reason they cannot make that climb?" No one spoke for a moment. Then Hiram Simmons, who was 81 years old and had lived in Harrow Creek longer than anyone in the room, raised one thin hand. "My knees," he said simply. "You'll be in the first group. Floyd and Colt will support you on the steep sections." The door opened behind her. Rhett Whitmore walked in. He looked at the room. He looked at Nell. He was wearing a better jacket than the one he had worn on the mountain 2 days ago, properly insulated, the kind a person changes into when they know they are going to be outside in serious cold for serious reasons. "I heard you were back," he said. "I need you," she said. "You know the North Route better than anyone here. I need you on point for the second and third groups." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the people in the pews, at Meg Holt's pale face against her mother's shoulder, at Hiram Simmons's raised hand still hanging in the air. Then he looked back at Nell. "Tell me the route," he said. Then Calhoun Whitmore walked through the door. He came in quietly the way he did everything without announcing himself, filling the room with his presence through mass and stillness rather than noise. He was dressed well warm, dry, every detail of him contrasting with the people huddled in the pews around him. He looked at Rhett first, a single sharp glance that contained an entire conversation about loyalty and expectation. Then he looked at Nell. "Callahan." His voice was the same voice he had used at the dinner table at her front door in every encounter between them. Measured, patient, certain of itself. What exactly are you proposing to do? Move these people to shelter. This is shelter. This is a church running out of firewood in a storm that isn't close to finished. She held his gaze. The child in the second pew has had a fever for 5 days. The stove is burning pewbacks. Hiram Simmons is 81 years old and sitting in a building that will be below 40 degrees by tonight. You don't have the authority. Tell me specifically what authority I would need, she said, to help a sick child. The room was completely silent. Calhoun looked at the people around him. He was a man who understood rooms. He understood how to read them and how to manage them and how to position himself within them. What he saw in this room in the faces of the people who had signed his letter and consolidated under his protection and accepted his version of events for the past 2 months was something he had not expected to find there. Not anger, not rebellion, just watching, just waiting. The quiet attention of people who have reached the end of their willingness to be managed. Renner, he said, shifting to Floyd, you've known me for 30 years. You know this woman is... I'm standing with the child, Floyd said. 3 words, quiet, final. Calhoun looked at the room one more time. At Rhett, who was looking at the floor. At Lester Holt, who was looking at his daughter. At Hiram Simmons, who was looking at Calhoun with the uncomplicated directness of a man with very little left to lose. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with a sound that was neither soft nor hard, just the sound of a thing ending. Rhett looked up from the floor. Something in his face had settled the way silt settles in water when it finally stops being disturbed. He looked at Nell. First group, she said, let's move. They worked through the rest of that day and into the next and into the day after that. 6 trips, each one a negotiation with weather and terrain and the limits of human endurance. Rhett led the way on the steep sections with the certainty of a man who has been walking these slopes since childhood. Floyd came behind each group, steady and methodical, never losing patience with the slow ones or the frightened ones. Colt turned out to have a gift for carrying children 2 at a time on his back through the deepest sections of the trail, making it seem easy in the way that strong young men can make impossible things seem easy. Nell was everywhere. She moved between the groups, checking on those at the front, circling back to those at the rear, monitoring condition and pace and morale with the same systematic attention she had applied to patients on a hospital floor. She did not let herself feel the cold in her own body until the work gave her a moment to feel it, and those moments were few. The cave received each group the same way. The warmth hit them at the entrance, that invisible threshold where the temperature changed and the mountain's interior made itself known. Some people gasped. Some stopped and stood with their eyes closed. The woman with the baby opened her coat and looked at the infant's face and seemed to be checking whether what she was feeling was real. Meg Holt's fever broke on the 2nd day in the cave. Nell was asleep on her platform when Meg's mother shook her awake in the early hours of the morning, and for 1/2 second, Nell was back in the hospital, coming awake for a patient, before she understood where she was and why she was being woken. She went to Meg and pressed her hand to the child's forehead and felt the change, the slight decrease in temperature, the skin no longer burning but simply warm. She went back to her platform and lay down and stared at the cave ceiling in the dark, and felt something release in her chest that she had not realized she had been holding. The storm raged for another 10 days. Inside the cave, 26 people organized themselves into a functioning community with surprising speed. There were conflicts because there always are when people are crowded together under stress arguments about space and food and noise, and who was responsible for keeping the entrance clear of accumulated snow. Nell mediated some of these and ignored others, applying the same triage principle she applied to everything addressed. What will become dangerous if unaddressed? Leave the rest alone. Edna Whitmore was among those who came up on the 3rd day. Calhoun had not sent her. She had come on her own, carrying a pack that held her own provisions, and a second wool blanket, and inexplicably a cast-iron skillet, which became the most useful piece of equipment in the cave for the remainder of the storm. She did not seek Nell out to apologize again. She found the food management problem, the challenge of distributing limited provisions equitably across 26 people with different needs, and she solved it organizing a rotation and a rationing system that was fairer than anything anyone else had proposed. She did this quietly and without asking for acknowledgement, which was Nell thought the correct way to make amends. Rhett stayed. That surprised people, though it did not surprise Nell. He slept near the entrance and took the first watch each night, a habit no one had asked him to establish. And he ran the steepest part of the North Trail 3 more times to bring up supplies from the church that would have been wasted otherwise. He worked with the economical purposefulness of someone who has decided something and does not need to discuss it. One evening, sitting near the pool while most of the cave was asleep, he said, "I knew what he was doing. To you." He did not look at her. "I told myself it was family business, that the land had always been Callahan land, and you were never really from here anyway." Nell listened. "That was easier than the alternative," he said. "The alternative being to say something." Yes. She considered this for a while. The pool moved. The warmth continued. "You said something when it mattered," she said finally. "Late. Late is better than never. Most people don't get there at all." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do when the storm ends?" She had been thinking about this, not anxiously, not urgently, just the way you think about the next step, when you have learned to take things in their proper sequence. "Stay for a while. There are things here worth learning more about." She looked at the water. "Then I'll see. You could come back to town. Maybe. Calhoun won't—" He stopped. "He's not going to be the same after this. I don't know exactly what that means, but it won't be the same." "I know," she said. The storm ended on a Tuesday. It ended the way it had come, without transition, without the gradual trailing off that most weather uses when it is finished. One morning, the wind simply stopped. The silence was so complete that it woke people who had been sleeping, deeply brought them upright and blinking, reaching for context, finding it in the suddenly unmoving air of the cave and the faint light coming through the entrance. Nell was already at the entrance when the first people emerged. She had been up before the silence, sensing the change, the way she had learned to sense changes in this mountain, through the small signals that accumulate into certainty before the obvious confirmation arrives. The sky outside was a particular blue that follows a major storm, deep and cold and absolutely clear. The kind of blue that seems to belong to a different atmosphere than the one that produced the weather. The snow was everywhere and perfect and undisturbed. The forest had been remade. Floyd came and stood beside her. They looked at it together. "The valley's buried," he said. "It'll clear. Give it a week." He was quiet for a moment. "When I came to your house, before all this." He stopped. "You don't have to." "I want to." He turned to look at her. "I told myself I was being practical. That emotion couldn't be allowed to cloud the community's interests. I use that word practical the way people use it when they mean comfortable." He looked back at the valley. "I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway." "You also walked up a mountain in a blizzard," Nell said. "That doesn't balance it." "No, but it's part of the same account." She looked at the white expanse below them. "People aren't simple, Floyd. They're not good or bad the way a legal document is valid or invalid. You made a wrong choice and then you made a right one. Most people only get to make one or the other." He did not respond to this, but she could see him taking it in, turning it over, doing with it what a certain kind of man does with things that matter, storing it somewhere careful for later use. The descent from the cave that week was gradual and practical. Families returning to assess their homes, men working together to clear roofs and paths and the church steps and the road to the feed store. Nell came down herself each day to help and then returned to the cave at night. She was not ready to leave it yet. She was not certain when she would be. Calhoun Whitmore came on the 4th day after the storm. She saw him on the lower trail while she was checking the eastern snares for the last time. She watched him climb. He was alone and moving slowly, not from physical difficulty, but from the pace of a man who is not rushing toward what he is going toward. He had the look of someone who has been arguing with himself for several days and has finally reluctantly reached a conclusion. She waited on the slope above the cave entrance as he made the last section of the trail. He stopped when he reached her, breathing steadily, looking not quite at her, but in the direction of the cave entrance a few yards above them. "I heard about the child," he said. "The Holt girl. She's fine." He nodded. He seemed to be working towards something, navigating toward it from an angle the way he navigated everything. Then he looked directly at her. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words spoken without embellishment, without the careful rhetorical framing he used for everything else. Just the words. Nell looked at him. She had rehearsed in her mind over the weeks on the mountain what she might say to him if this moment came. The particular truth she had earned the right to deliver. The account she was owed. She had imagined those conversations at different moments, with different emotional temperatures, and in none of them had the opening words been as simple as the ones he had just said. She let the silence stand for a moment. "I know," she said. He looked at the cave entrance, at the warmth visible in the way the snow had not accumulated there, the bare ground around the opening that had been the first sign she had followed. "The land," he began. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want it anymore." She looked up past the cave entrance, at the ridgeline above, at the stone in the sky. "I found something better." He stood there for a moment longer. She could see him processing this, recalibrating against an outcome he had not expected, trying to determine if it was a strategy of some kind. Then something in his face changed, not dramatically, but genuinely, the specific change that happens when a man who has been carrying a defensive posture for a long time is told that the thing he was defending against is no longer coming. He nodded once, turned, went back down the trail. She watched him go until the trees took him. Then she turned and climbed the last few yards to the cave entrance and went inside. The place was mostly quiet now. A few people still remained, the last ones to return to their homes, sitting near the pool in the particular stillness of people who know they are about to leave somewhere and are taking the last of it in. Edna was reorganizing the remaining food supply with her characteristic efficiency, making sure nothing was wasted. Colt had fallen asleep against the far wall, still wearing his coat. Seth Pruitt was sitting closest to the pool. He was the last person Nell had brought up from the church on the final trip, one she had made herself at the end of the 3rd day, when she found him still sitting in the empty building, alone with his old blanket and his refusal to be a burden. She had sat beside him for 10 minutes without speaking, and then said simply that she was not leaving without him, and he had understood that she meant it, and he had stood up with the careful movements of an old man managing old pain and followed her up the mountain. Now he sat near the pool in the quiet cave with his hands on his knees and looked at the water and the stone and the warmth moving through the air of the place. Nell sat beside him. He did not speak for a while. That was his way. She had learned it over 5 years of morning coffee and fence line conversations, the way his silences were not empty, but occupied the way he used them to arrive at what he actually meant to say. "Daniel would be proud of you," he said finally. She looked at Daniel's knife. She had been carrying it on her belt for weeks, through every trip up and down the mountain, through every crisis and decision and sleepless night. It had not saved her life in any direct way. It had pointed her in a direction. It had been present. That was what it had done. She reached down and took it from her belt, held it for a moment in the weight of it familiar in her hand, the worn handle shaped by decades of someone else's grip. Then she turned to the wall beside the pool and found the narrow recess she had noticed weeks ago, the one that held the old water level marks, the record of whoever had been here before her. She set the knife into the recess point, down handle, up, held in place by the slight pressure of the stone on either side. It fit as though the space had been made for it. She stepped back. Seth looked at the knife in the wall. He understood without being told. "You're not taking it with you," he said. "It belongs here. It got me here." She looked at it one last time. That's what it was for. Seth pushed himself slowly to his feet. He stood for a moment looking around the cave, taking in the full measure of the place. The stone, the pool, the warmth that came from somewhere deeper than weather, deeper than season, deeper than the decisions of any particular winter. "I'll walk down with you," he said. "Not yet." She looks toward the entrance, at the light coming in, at the distant sound of people moving in the valley below, the sound of a town beginning to reassemble itself. "Give me a few more minutes." He went ahead. She listened to his careful steps diminish toward the entrance and then disappear into the outside air. She sat alone by the pool. The water moved. The warmth continued. Somewhere deep in the rock, the same processes that had been running for thousands of years before she arrived were continuing, indifferent to storms and documents and the small, fierce disputes of the people who lived on the surface above them. The earth maintained its temperature. The water rose. The stone held the heat. She had spent 5 years trying to belong to a place to earn, a place to be accepted as part of a community that had its own long history and its own established hierarchies and its own calculus about who was from here and who was not. She had tried to belong by being useful and by being quiet and by adapting to what the community expected, and in the end, none of that had been enough because belonging in that sense was not something she could earn from people who had decided before she arrived what she was allowed to be. But she had found something else, not belonging in the sense of being accepted, belonging in the older sense. The way a stone belongs to a mountain, not because anyone decided it did, but because that is simply where it is, where it fits, where it has made itself adequate to the conditions, and the conditions have made themselves adequate to it. She stood. She picked up Daniel's notebook from the sleeping platform. She did not take it with her. She placed it on the shelf near the pool beside the stone where she had been recording temperatures and water levels and wind direction for the past 6 weeks. Someone might find it one day. Someone might find all of it, the marks on the wall, and the notebook, and the knife in the recess, and understand that people had been here, had survived here, had learned the shape of this warmth, and added their own careful record to it. That seemed right to her. That seemed like the correct thing to leave behind. She walked to the entrance, ducked through, stood upright in the cold outside air. The sky was still that deep, impossible blue. The valley below was still white and still and slowly filling with the small, moving figures of people going back to their lives. She started down. She had gone perhaps 50 yards when she heard Seth behind her, not hurrying, just keeping pace, his footsteps steady in the snow. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She knew the sound of someone walking beside her without needing to be asked. The valley came up to meet her as she descended, growing larger and more detailed. With every step, the rooftops and the fence lines and the smoke beginning to rise again from the chimneys one by one as people returned and rebuilt their fires. Harrow Creek looked from the slope above it like a thing that had been tested and had held imperfectly with considerable damage, but had held. She had helped it hold. Not because she owed it anything, not because she had forgiven everything that had been done to her, because forgiveness, she had learned on the mountain, was a long process that did not complete itself in a single act of generosity. But because she was who she was, and who she was had not changed because Calhoun Whitmore had put a document on a table, and who she was did not require Harrow Creek's recognition to remain true. The warmth the mountain had given her was hers now, in the way that important things become yours, not because you own them, but because they have changed you into something that could not have existed without them. She kept walking. Behind her, the cave held its warmth the way it always had, the way it would long after this winter became a story people told their grandchildren, the way it would continue when the grandchildren were old and the story was mostly forgotten. The earth kept its temperature. The water kept rising. The stone kept the heat.